In Atlanta, Georgia, in the year 1850, as the city struggled to define itself in the shadow of expanding railroads and entrenched slavery, one enslaved man became the center of a scandal so disturbing that it was whispered about for decades and deliberately erased from official memory. He left no autobiography, no portrait, no recorded testimony in his own voice, yet plantation letters, court hints, church disciplinary notes, and private diaries point again and again to the same unnamed figure, an enslaved man described repeatedly as exceptionally handsome, whose presence inside white households coincided with the quiet collapse of at least 17 families. What made this case unusual was not romance or seduction, but the explosive collision of beauty, power, denial, and fear inside a slave society already cracking under its own contradictions. Atlanta in 1850 was not yet the sprawling metropolis it would become. It was a tense, growing rail junction, rough at the edges, ambitious at its core. Slavery was everywhere, but rarely discussed openly. Enslaved labor built homes, cleaned them, cooked meals, raised children, and moved silently through private spaces where white respectability was supposed to remain uncontaminated. What happened behind closed doors stayed there, unless it threatened reputation, inheritance, or control. The man at the center of this story was enslaved on the eastern edge of the city, hired out frequently and moved between households, an arrangement that already placed him in an unusual position. Hiring out allowed enslaved men to work in homes other than their owners, often as valets, drivers, or domestic attendants. This mobility created opportunity, but also danger. Records from Fulton County show an unnamed enslaved man repeatedly transferred between households under special discretion, a phrase plantation owners used when something had gone wrong but could not be named. Physical descriptions appear in fragments. A merchant's wife wrote in an 1849 letter that a house servant of uncommon symmetry and grace unsettled her guests. A Presbyterian minister's journal complained of a certain Negro man whose appearance invites impropriety and disorder within the household. None of these writers named him. Naming would have meant acknowledging what could not be acknowledged, that the rigid racial hierarchy of the South was being destabilized from the inside. What mattered most was not what this man did, but what others projected onto him. In a society obsessed with racial purity, white masculinity, and female virtue, an enslaved man who was visibly attractive became a walking contradiction. He was property, yet desired, powerless, yet feared. His mere presence raised questions no one was willing to answer publicly. By late 1850, a pattern begins to emerge in private records. A respected rail official abruptly sent his wife and children north. A plantation owner sold land to cover unexplained debts. A church elder resigned without explanation after his wife was sent to relatives for her health. In at least 17 documented households, something broke. Marriages fractured, inheritances were rearranged, reputations quietly died. And in each case, letters reference the sudden removal or resale of a male house servant described in strikingly similar terms. No criminal trial was ever held. That alone tells us something. If an enslaved man had been accused of assault, the punishment would have been swift and public. Instead, we see silence, transfers, and forced forgetting. This suggests the threat was not violence, but exposure. Exposure of consensual desire, coercive relationships initiated by enslavers, or sexual arrangements that inverted the moral narrative white society told about itself. Importantly, there is no evidence that this man seduced anyone in the way later sensational retellings claim. The language of seduction comes from later retellings, not contemporary documents. What is documented is fear. fear that white women were not as insulated from desire as ideology demanded, and fear that white men were not as in control of their households as they claimed. Enslaved men were often punished not for crimes, but for disrupting illusion. Beauty in this context was dangerous. It blurred lines. It made denial harder. It forced private reckoning where public narratives demanded certainty. By the end of 1850, this man disappears from Atlanta's records entirely. No death certificate, no sale receipt, no runaway notice. He simply vanishes. Historians suspect he was sold south, where record-keeping was looser and visibility lower. Others believe he was deliberately removed from paper history to protect prominent families whose names still appear on Atlanta streets today. What remains is not a legend of destruction, but a case study in how slavery consumed everyone it touched. The families did not fall because of a single man's beauty. They fractured because a system built on ownership of human beings could not survive contact with truth inside its own homes. This story is not about temptation. It is about repression, not about scandal, but about silence. And it begins here in Atlanta, 1850, where one enslaved man became a mirror no one wanted to look into. By mid-1850, the damage caused by the unnamed enslaved man was no longer isolated. It was patterned. To understand how 17 families collapsed, investigators must move away from rumor and into domestic space, the kitchens, parlors, back staircases, and servants' quarters where slavery operated most intimately. The first household to show visible strain belonged to a mid-level railroad administrator. His home stood less than a mile from the eastern rail spur. Letters written by his wife reveal a growing anxiety, not toward the enslaved man himself, but toward her husband's increasingly erratic behavior. She describes unspoken tension, sudden rule changes, and the unexplained reassignment of a house servant who had previously been trusted with everything. Within months, she and the children were sent north for rest. The enslaved man was quietly transferred. This pattern repeats. In household after household, the man was not accused of wrongdoing. Instead, he was removed abruptly, often after weeks of increased proximity to family members, serving meals, assisting with dressing, accompanying women during daytime errands. These were not privileges, they were labor assignments. But in a society where racial hierarchy relied on distance, proximity itself became destabilizing. In one documented case, a plantation owner's daughter was withdrawn from social activities and later married hastily to a man twice her age. A diary entry from her aunt notes only that a presence in the home invited confusion that could not be endured. Again, the enslaved man was sold within days. What becomes clear is that the collapse of these families was not driven by a single scandalous event, but by cumulative pressure. Desire, fear, jealousy, and denial existed simultaneously. White men feared exposure of their own households. White women were expected to be passive symbols of purity. Enslaved men were expected to be invisible. This man was none of those things. His appearance, frequently described as refined, symmetrical, and composed, clashed violently with white supremacist ideology, which depended on portraying black men as brutish or subhuman. Beauty disrupted the story slavery told about itself. In at least 4 households, financial documents show sudden liquidation of assets following his removal. Land was sold, credit lines were closed. These were not emotional decisions, they were damage control. Silence had a cost. Church discipline records offer another layer. Elders resigned without charges. Families relocated congregations. Sermons from the period increasingly emphasized temptation within the home and the dangers of disorder among servants. The language is indirect but unmistakable. Importantly, there is no evidence that the enslaved man sought influence, power, or attention.
No record suggests manipulation. He did not run away. He did not petition for freedom. He remained where he was placed. That passivity is critical. The threat was not rebellion. It was reflection. His presence forced enslavers to confront truths they could not articulate, that their control was incomplete, that desire did not obey racial law, and that the domestic sphere was not as sealed as ideology promised. By the time the 17th family fractured, Atlanta's informal elite had reached consensus. The man could not remain.
Slavery was not chaotic. It was bureaucratic. When a problem emerged, the system responded methodically. Records show that the enslaved man was reassigned more frequently in late 1850 than at any other time. Each transfer placed him farther from the city center. This was containment, not punishment. Why no trial? Because a trial would require testimony. Testimony would require words, and words would fracture the illusion of moral order. In the antebellum South, enslaved men accused of sexual misconduct were typically executed or mutilated. That this man was not suggests the accusations could not be spoken without implicating white households themselves. Instead, the system used erasure. No sale bill survives. No transportation ledger lists him by description. It is likely his name, whatever it was deliberately altered or omitted. This was not unusual. Slavery allowed for the manipulation of identity as easily as property. Atlanta newspapers from late 1850 show a subtle shift in tone. Articles emphasize order, discipline, and proper separation. This was ideological cleanup. The man's removal stabilized the city's social surface, but not its conscience. Private correspondence continues to reference the incident for years afterward. It became a cautionary ghost story among elites, never written, never taught. This was not justice, it was containment.
The story's survival depends on fragments because silence was the intended outcome. Historians reconstruct this case not to sensationalize, but to understand how slavery functioned when its myths failed. The enslaved man was dangerous not because of action, but because of contradiction. He exposed the lie that power alone could regulate desire. The phrase, "destroyed 17 families," is misleading. Families were already fragile, built on ownership, coercion, and denial. His presence simply applied pressure. It is also critical to reject later retellings that frame him as a seducer. That narrative shifts blame downward. Contemporary documents show no evidence of agency beyond existence. In this sense, the enslaved man becomes symbolic, not as a mythic figure, but as a human mirror. He revealed what could not be reconciled, that slavery corrupted intimacy itself.
The man's disappearance is complete. No grave, no name, no descendants traced. That absence is not accidental. What remains is Atlanta, a city that grew, modernized, and buried its contradictions under progress. Streets were renamed, families regained respectability, but the structure that enabled the damage persisted. This story is not about beauty. It is about proximity under oppression, about what happens when a system built on ownership collides with human reality. 17 families fell not because of one enslaved man, but because slavery demanded silence where truth lived. And history, for a long time, agreed to look away.